It's a great honor and joy to be here with you this evening at an event that celebrates and helps support an organization that typifies what it means to be a Franciscan. I'm grateful to Kim, to the rest of the staff, to the Board of Franciscan Mission Service for the invitation to be with you as we recognize the good work that Jack and Just Faith Ministries have accomplished over many years to remind women and men of faith that central to their baptismal vocation as Christian disciples is the call to return to God, that divine love first and always extended to us by working for justice and peace in our world. This, as you all know, is not a new concept, but an ancient one. One that finds its most succinct articulation in that well-known passage from the book of the prophet Micah that we heard Kim mention earlier in passing. When asked, what is it that God desires of us? What is it that the Lord requires of you? Our response is only this: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. And Micah is not alone, but rather expresses what God has disclosed for centuries in the prophets and in the scriptures. It is, in essence, a distillation of what we hear proclaimed by the prophet Isaiah, what Jesus announces as his mission statement in Luke 4, what we heard Jack remind us of, and that is the reign of God, and instantiating that in our life, in our world, all around us. And it is that mission statement that we recognize St. Francis of Assisi most fully embraced in his life. And it is what Franciscan Mission Service models in its work and in its purpose. So tonight, picking up on a theme that's already somewhat resonant, I'd like to speak a little bit about two men named Francis. You didn't see this one coming. And how they call new disciples of peace, justice, and hope, one the medieval saint and the source of our spiritual, theological, and ministerial tradition, and the other the modern bishop, whose words and actions have captivated and challenged otherwise an incredulous group of people with a sense of awe and wonder, with a sense of inspiration, a sense that the joy of the gospel finds its truest home when women and men of faith are open to being profoundly changed, such that they can live as true disciples. But in order to do that, I first need to share with you what might seem like a shocking fact, so bear with me. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that is unique or at all special about the Franciscan spiritual tradition. Whereas other religious orders and communities that will go unnamed, you can fill in the blank, some rhyme with Schmezowitz, others rhyme with Order of Meechers, and so on and so forth. Whereas these other communities, good as they are, have made marketing their distinctive approaches to spirituality a veritable industry, the Franciscans, and you know this, all of you, really all too well probably, have always had a difficult time encapsulating what exactly the spiritual tradition of the Franciscans is really all about. Does that sound familiar? Somebody asks you, what's a Franciscan? You say that guy, that Chaucer wrote about, or that cookie jar that's kind of chubby and you take off his head to get the cookies. Sure, everybody loves the Franciscans. And St. Francis remains one of the most popular saints of all time. Yet, few can succinctly express what is so special, what is so unique. The reason, I think, is that the Franciscan tradition is both the most simple and therefore, I believe, the most complicated of spiritual traditions, which is why it's so hard for so many people to talk about it. Many people try to identify the core feature, right, or the theme of Franciscan spirituality, and they do so by naming characteristics like poverty, or solidarity with the marginalized, or simplicity, or love of creation, right, or popular preaching. That wasn't to make fun of him because he narrows this, but people love creation, right? Francis loved animals. Or fraternity and community, or this or that, some particular thing. And all these things are indeed part of the Franciscan tradition. It's part of our life. But these and so many other aspects of the Franciscan life, the life lived by professed Franciscan friars and sisters, those who are lay missioners, those who have Franciscan hearts, all of those who identify with the Franciscan life, these things are secondary. These arise from something I believe is more foundational, more central, more basic, and more simple, hence the challenge. That is that what the entirety of Franciscan spirituality is all about is relationship. And it's from relationship that the characteristics of evangelical poverty, love of creation, solidarity with the marginalized, and all else flows. But in order to understand a little bit about why the concept of relationship is so significant, we first need to take a step back and try our best to remember the name of God. The name of God. See, contrary to what you might have heard in Sunday school, which you may currently believe, the name of God is not I am, or I am who am. The name of God is not being, or essay, for those of you Thomists out there, or any other medieval version. The name of God is not omnipotence, or omniscience, or omni-anything. The name of God is relationship. Where most people go astray in thinking about the name of God is actually the same scriptural source that I believe reveals God's full name. Recall that theophany in Exodus 3, in which Moses, having been called to a sacred place by God, takes off his shoes, of course, like a good guest, and then engages in one of the most famous conversations in the history of salvation. Those gathered to share the collective story of God's love for us might hear in this, God revealed to Moses God's very name, a name so holy that it should not be said, a name signified by 4 letters, YHWH, which will come to be translated centuries later as I am. Now, that's us throwing in vowels in a vowelless language. I am, right? I am who am. Oh my gosh, what about religious formation, Jen? Just kidding. The test will be later, after dessert. But the original hearers of this story would understand the complexities and the richness of God's name that is eventually lost in translation and forgotten through the centuries of selective memory. What is actually revealed is the name that describes who this God is. Not limiting God as the more philosophical rendering of I am so often does. Perhaps a more accurate rendering of God's name in translation reads, I am the one who will be there for you. It bespeaks a relationship in future. It tells the whole story of God's relationship with humanity and all creation in summary. When Moses goes to Pharaoh on behalf of God's people, he is to say that he is sent by the one who journeys with the chosen people. We see this in the often overlooked next verse in the book of Exodus, where God explains to Moses who God is in another, clearer, and more relational way. I'll read to you from sacred scripture. God spoke to Moses, "Thus shall you say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations." The name of God is precisely who God is, a God who is with us, who loves us, and who will be there for us. This is made even clearer in the next line. Oh, if only we just kept reading the Bible. God continues to speak to Moses, "Go and assemble the elders of the Israelites and tell them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I am concerned about you and about the way you are being treated in Egypt. So I've decided to lead you up out of the misery of Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey." When we don't just stop with I am, but read on to hear God explain who God is to Moses, we come to see that God is concerned about us in the way that we are treated. God is not some abstract deity, but a creator who is head over heels in love with humanity and seeks what is best for creation out of that love and out of that concern. The name of God is not some philosophical abstraction, but as God says to Moses, "This is my name forever, the name of God is relationship. But the story of God's name doesn't stop with Exodus, in that Exodus from Egypt, or the remembering of the real name of God. No, the gospel, the good news, tells the completion of this story, adds the climax, and represents the pinnacle of a God whose name is relationship. As the letter to the Hebrews notes, before God came among us as one of us, God revealed God's self to us in varied and partial ways through the prophets and through creation and through Scripture. But with Jesus Christ, we have the fullness of God revealed to us. A God who desires so much to draw near to us that divinity is not deemed something to be held on to, and instead God surrenders all control, all knowing, all power, all presence, all anything, omni this, omni that. It makes the impossible possible by emptying himself to become one of us. The whole of Jesus' mission and ministry, the whole of the good news, is simply one example after another in this proclamation of the reign of God, of how Jesus Christ lives up to his heavenly name, relationship. See, if the whole gospel, really, if all of sacred Scripture is about relationship, about God's self-disclosure of who God is and what God is all about, then the Franciscan tradition is entirely about relationship. Peacemaking. Francis came to discover that peacemaking was not an optional exercise reserved for a few special saints, but one of the foundational characteristics of what it means to be human. His famous Canticle of the Creatures makes this strikingly clear. The first 9 verses or so present a vision of creation in relationship with its creator, in ways easily hijacked over the years by sentimentality and overly romantic depictions of a tree-hugging hippie in the hillsides of Italy, instantiated, I think, again in those beautiful statues that we plant covered in birds and bird droppings and surrounded by beautiful flowers and plants and so forth. But rather, humanity plays a key, if at first embarrassing, role in this hymn. So it begins or focuses primarily on these other aspects, these non-human aspects of creation. But Francis actually opens his address in the Canticle of the Creatures, his address to God, saying that God should be praised and that human beings are unworthy to utter God's name. And then he goes on, right, through many different elements of creation, the sun, the moon, stars, water, wind, fire, and so forth, recognizing both that each aspect of the created order gives praise to God, and that each is Francis's brother and sister in the cosmic community of creation. How each aspect of creation gives praise to God, though, this is the key. Brother Sun, Francis tells us, gives praise to God by giving rays of light and providing warmth and sunshine, and Mother Earth gives praise to God by providing all things with life, giving us plants and herbs. And each aspect of creation, in turn, gives praise to God by being exactly what God created it to be. But how does humanity give praise to God? Does humanity give praise to God? When Francis finally adds the verse about human beings, he says this: "Praised be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation. Blessed are those who endure in peace, for by you most high shall they be crowned." Blessed are the peacemakers. Human beings give praise to God when they are most naturally themselves, when they forgive, when they bear difficult circumstances in love, when they are peacemakers. Peace is not something for the few, but the model of human action and prayer. So again, I ask, if the name of God is relationship, then who do we say that we are? Justice, Francis tells us. Justice is when all people are treated with inherent and unalienable dignity, that which God has bestowed on them by virtue of their very existence. This means that those who even the state labels the enemy Whether the Saracens of Francis's time during the Fifth Crusade, or anybody, for example, that the US might feel could interfere with its ability to maintain its status as superpower, all people, rich and poor, black and white, documented or undocumented, all people are to be viewed as sister and brother in the community of creation, embraced and loved as God has loved us. But in order to work for justice, which, as Pope Paul VI famously reminded us, is the means for us to find peace, we must take seriously what St. Francis said to his brothers in Admonition 19. What you are before God, that you are, nothing else. Nobody is more or less than what they are in the eyes of God, individually loved and brought into existence, sustained by that love, and held in relationship that is God's very self. We must learn to see with the eyes of God and recognize how the Creator sees each person. And again, I ask, if the name of God is relationship, then who do we say we are? Hope is something that Francis of Assisi gives all people who are drawn to a man whose whole life was oriented toward following in the footprints of the God-named relationship who became one of us. Hope is the realization that Francis of Assisi, like the spiritual tradition that bears his name, isn't all that special. I'm sorry. Hope is facing the truth that you and me, that we have the same task set before us that medieval son of a cloth merchant once had 800 years ago. Hope is knowing, although we really don't like to admit it, that we too are called to live the good news in word and in deed by announcing the inbreaking of the reign of God, as once Jesus did, having been led by the Spirit to his hometown, to pick up the tradition of his people according to the prophet Isaiah, and to demonstrate what has been proclaimed as and will be fulfilled in your hearing. Hope is the hard truth that Francis of Assisi was once an ordinary, comfortable, normal, young person. And that we who are all those things, and as Kim pointed out, I realize I look much younger than some other people, but at least those of us too who are young of heart, realizing that we too are these things, also have the responsibility and the possibility of being not another St. Francis, but a St. Dan, and a St. Jack, and a St. Kim, and a St. so on and so on. All of us who bear the name of Christ, who like him were anointed in baptism, we were anointed Christos, can respond in the same way Francis did. The whole world can be filled with women and men and children seen by each other as what they are before God, and become peacemakers, thereby joining the rest of the community of creation in praising God. That is a challenging and scary vision for some, but one that should also give us hope. So again, I ask, the name of God is relationship, then who do we say that we are? There's so much that can be said about the current Bishop of Rome, who has understandably garnered the world's attention in such a short period of time. Why? Why has a previously unknown church bureaucrat from Argentina caused such a stir? Perhaps it's for the same reason that a previously unknown young man from Assisi caused such a stir in his time. After the election of Jorge Bergoglio and the nearly instantaneous effect that he began to have in terms of the shift in papal priorities and practices, little things at first, little things that mean so much, lots of journalists began looking into his past. I think they were fueled by the scandal-driven machine that is our never-ending news cycle, to find something salacious, something incongruous, something that would be sure to get ratings concerning the new Pope's past. Some made much to do about his tenure as a young Jesuit superior. Others found similar points to emphasize, but what I find interesting, especially about this dynamic, was the latent presupposition that drives such an action. Namely, that we don't believe that anybody could be a saint anymore. Nothing is new here. Even Jesus famously noted that no prophet is without honor except in his homeland. Isn't that Joe the carpenter's little boy? Wasn't he the kid that grew up with my son John? Isn't that Pietro de Bernadone's little boy Francesco? Wasn't he the one always out drinking with his friends late? Isn't that Jorge? Wasn't he the Jesuit superior during the Argentinian War that made some bad decisions? Who do they think they are? Everybody asks. My theory is that in a world that knows no privacy and forgets nothing, a world of browser histories and website cookies and NSA surveillance and so on, we have shredded our sense of peace, justice, and hope through hyping up the fact that none of us are without sin, including the saints, including St. Francis, which I believe is exactly why Pope Francis began his famous interview last fall, simply stating clearly that, quote, "I am a sinner." Once we get that out of the way, then maybe we can begin to realize that the authentic challenge of the gospel can come from each of us. And then comes the hard truth that we too are called to preach it and to be missionaries of good news in the world. In this way, I feel very strongly that Pope Francis has so far lived up very well to his name. Like Francis of Assisi, Jorge Bergoglio is a sinner and is imperfect, just like you and just like me. And just like you and just like me, he has been called to be a peacemaker, to work for justice, and to be a sign of hope in the world. This is what is so radically reminding us today. This is why he so radically captured the attention of such a population of everybody, it seems. On peacemaking, Francis is entirely pragmatic, as he is in so many ways, noting that we can easily be overwhelmed, we can be frozen by what he calls diagnostic overload. I love that phrase. He talks about the diagnostic overload of our time. In the face of the 24-hour news cycle with pain and suffering on an unimaginable scale worldwide, we can feel frozen. We can begin to justify inaction. Yet on the topic of peacemaking, he says there are many different kinds of wars, not dismissing violent physical altercations. He says in our neighborhoods and in our workplaces, how many wars are caused by envy and jealousy, even among Christians? Spiritual worldliness leads some Christians to war with other Christians and others who stand in the way of their quest for power, prestige, pleasure, and economic security. Some even are no longer content to live as part of the greater church community, but stoke a spirit of exclusivity, creating an inner circle, the so-called real Christians or the like. Peacemaking, then, does not mean starting with heroic acts with an eye toward a Nobel Peace Prize. Peacemaking begins with what is right in front of us, but are we willing, to be what God has created us to be? On the subject of justice, Pope Francis follows his namesake, noting that the way the poor and the outcast are presented in our world are not actually those who occupy this or that part of society, but, as he says, are non-people, who, he goes on, are like the food they are so often forbidden from accessing. These non-people are thrown away. We do not recognize the inherent dignity of each person, rather than seeing women and men and children of God as God sees them. We see them so often as the capitalist market sees them, as nothing. Our political, economic, and many personal decisions are made so often with that in mind. When certain politicians here in Washington vociferously condemn the Affordable Care Act, effectively damning millions to indignity, pain, suffering, and perhaps preventable death, are they thinking about the poor down the road in Anacostia? Or the homeless veterans under our bridges? Or the young, non-traditional students in our community colleges working as hard as they can? Through what lens are our sisters and brothers viewed? That of what they are before God? Or maybe that of what they are before Wall Street? This apostolic exhortation is about hope, I believe. Hope which is like the peace that we are told by Jesus Christ the world cannot give. The hope is that each of us will, like many women and men who trained and are sent as missioners to South America and Africa, like those many parishioners who participate in just faith, we can respond to the universal baptismal call to live the gospel. It can be done, as St. Francis came to realize, only in community. To take the Franciscan spiritual tradition seriously is to take seriously the God whose name is relationship. I believe that Franciscan mission service illustrates for us the manifold ways this can be done, but it's not up to the staff and the missioners alone. Each of us has been anointed for this purpose. Each of us is called to embrace the profound change that's necessary to be disciples of peace, justice, and hope. And each of us, I believe, is left to ask, if the name of God is relationship, then who do we say